Every community has those conversations that seem to float around in the air. You walk into the grocery store in Church Point, and someone leans over their buggy to whisper to you something that they just heard from a friend. You go to the ball game in Eunice, and another person shares what a cousin said about a neighbor. And by the time the stories float their way back to Richard or Savoie, they've already changed 3 times or more. More often than not, people don't get upset when they hear gossip. They're mostly upset because they say, well, that's not what I heard. And while we might shake our heads and say, people just need to mind their own business, we're certainly tempted to lean back in our chairs a little bit to listen to the juicy story that's going on at the table behind us. It's almost a tradition. We like to know what everyone's up to. We disguise it as genuine care. Well, I'm just making sure that they're all right. We like to decide also who's right and who's wrong, who's lazy, who's working, and who's not. There's something about the unknown that makes us easy, so we'll fill up the gaps with half-truths and, if need be, a little bit of gossip. All that noise, however, shapes the atmosphere of our homes, our parish, and our community. What's even more dangerous is how it changes our hearts slowly over time. Gossip gives us a false sense of control. It pulls our eyes away from our own life to focus on the imperfection of others. It distracts us from the places in our heart that we'd rather leave hidden. St. Paul saw this in the Thessalonian church. Some Christians had stopped working. They were idle. They were restless. And they were spending their time minding the business of others. They filled the silence with talk because silence forced them to face themselves. They were looking for distractions, not growth and holiness. And St. Paul doesn't scold them, but he does give them the remedy, saying, look, if you want to be a good Christian, here's what you must do. Work quietly, eat your own food, and live out your own vocation, which is the apostolic way of saying, mind your own business. Because underneath all the noise that we hear is a wound, and one that we don't like to admit. We are not comfortable with the fact that God searches us and knows us. We certainly don't like people to see who we really are. We go out of our way to present a different image to the world, and sometimes our home lives are far more different than our public lives. And why? Because it's easier to look out, because then we don't have to look in. It's easier to criticize someone else than to allow Christ to correct our own decisions. That is the exact place that Jesus walks into in today's gospel. The disciples had come from Galilee, and they are seeing for the first time the Temple of Jerusalem. Its grandeur in scale would be equivalent to St. Peter's Basilica today. Structures like that just didn't exist everywhere. And these were disciples coming from the countryside to see this for the first time, and they're amazed by the stones and the gems and the sheer size of it. And what does Jesus say? One day, all this is going to be gone, right? It's like, Jesus, can you just let us enjoy this for a moment? He's not saying that, he doesn't care about that temple. What he is telling them is, don't stop there. Remember what we talked about last time? Sometimes we get caught up on beauty that we forget to go further. Jesus wasn't leading them to the temple, he was leading them through it. They couldn't stop there, and they weren't spiritual tourists. They were there to accomplish a mission, the mission of Christ. And so the disciples asked him, of course, the same questions we would ask. When is this going to happen? And what signs can we look for when we know that the temple is about to collapse? Because I don't want to be in there when it falls down, Lord. It's their way of trying to get control of a situation that they're uncomfortable with now. When we're uncertain, we start asking questions to give us a sense of control again. And yet Jesus gives them nothing. In fact, he goes on this long teaching about the end of the world. And we wonder why people were so slow to ask Jesus questions. Because he never answers the question you ask, but the question that's in your heart instead. He says, first, see that you not be deceived. There will be many who tell you that they know the hour and the day when the temple will fall. Don't listen to them. Second, do not be terrified. There will those who will tell you that you should be frightened because of the signs of the times. Jesus says, don't be afraid. And third, this will lead to your giving testimony. Don't be concerned about the end of time, because you'll know when it comes, because you'll be tested. You'll be persecuted. You'll be hated. How will you know if you're left behind in some rapture? Well, it's not that you'll be caught up into the sky. You just won't be arrested because they won't know you're a Christian. In other words, the world will shake. Crisis will come. Systems will collapse. But those who belong to God will always stand firm. Nations rise against nations. Earthquakes, famines, and persecutions spread throughout the land. Even family and friends betray one another. Jesus isn't trying to scare us. He's just reminding us of the reality of a fallen world that is obsessed with sin. But he's saying is that when the persecutions come, do not panic. That's the worst time to panic. Because in the moment of crisis is the time where Christians are called to shine with the light of Christ. In the crisis is our moment to give the most courageous testimony of the gospel. He adds this line at the end of the gospel that should unlock all of this for us. By your perseverance, you will secure your lives. Now, what about all those martyrs? They persevered, and they were still killed. But they did secure their eternal lives. And they lived what Christ warns us against here. It was not by their panic, not by their opinions, not by their predictions that they were able to withstand the test. It was by their faithfulness and their obedience to God and His Word. That's what made them shine as beacons of the faith. That's why for every martyr that was killed, 10 more Christians popped up in their place. We don't have to look far to see why this warning of Jesus matters even now. Everyone here knows that the last few years have felt off. People argue about the country, they worry about the church, and they're nervous about the future, not only for themselves, but for their kids and grandchildren. We fall into those same temptations that the disciples did with Jesus. We want answers, we want signs, we want assurances. Sometimes we need someone to blame, and we want to control the situation. Because if we're controlling it, then at least we're doing something. And meanwhile, Christ only wants one thing: for us to trust Him. Every question we ask Him in prayer, his answer is always, "Do you trust me?" You see, dear friends, gossip in our community is not really about gossip. Idle worries in our community are not really about laziness. The anger and suspicion we all feel sometimes is not really about politics. It's all about fear. It always is. A deep fear. A fear that everything that we hold dear could vanish in the blink of an eye. A fear that we won't know what to do when a crisis comes. That when something happens, we won't be able to fix it. It's the fear that God won't show up when everything starts to go wrong. It's the fear that our hidden sins might become public. It's a fear that people will see us as we truly are and not how we wish to be. So we talk about others. We speculate about things that don't matter. And we insert ourselves into situations that really we have no business being in. And we even let social media form our consciences more than Jesus and his word. But Jesus is clear. The disciples who will survive are the ones who persevere, remain faithful, and steady their hearts in the presence of Jesus. Which brings us to the Eucharist, as it always does. The Eucharist can teach us more than any book and could proclaim a truth far greater than any headline. Because at this altar, Christ comes to us in the silence. Not the earthquakes, not the signs in the sky. We can't compete with the exciting churches of this day and age because all we have is the quiet and humble Eucharist. Simple bread and humble wine. The quiet reminder that God's presence is in the midst of his faithful people. In the still quiet moment. Not the spectacle, not the signs in the sky, not the excitement, but in the stillness. And here he doesn't promise that our buildings will last forever. He doesn't promise that our culture will endure forever. He doesn't even promise that our country will be here in 100 years. All he promises is this: whatever happens to you, you will never face it alone. Not a hair on your head will be destroyed, he says. He's not saying that we'll always escape suffering. He is saying that no matter what, no enemy will ever have the final word against us. The proof is already in front of our eyes. In the past 2,000 years, empires have been built and empires have collapsed. Nations have been conquered. Wars have been fought. Natural disasters have raged. And yet, the Eucharist is unchanged in 2,000 years. Still the same Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity. And his church that he founded to do this in memory of him is still here. One holy, Catholic, apostolic church. And why? Because he said the gates of hell will never prevail against her. All those things that people put their hope in are gone. The Eucharist that saints put their hope in endures. This humble bread has accomplished more than any of us ever could. The popes in Rome, without this, they're just playing dress up. Priests leaving everything behind We have no power if that's just bread. We have nothing to live for if we don't have the body and blood of our Lord to live for. Because as Jesus said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have life within you. It's no surprise that people walk around half dead. They walk around with half their heart missing. The greatest witness of a person's belief in the real presence of the Eucharist is if they are afraid of everything that the world is afraid of. But if they believe, then they live that beautiful truth of every saint: what do I have to lose? All I have is the gospel to give. Only a heartfelt devotion to the Eucharist can train us to live the way Christ is asking us to live. Because when we receive him, he gives us the wisdom that he promised. And in the end, if we can't trust him here in the quiet, even when things are shaking or unsteady, how will we trust him when he comes again in glory? We'll be terrified of him if we don't recognize him here. Blessedly, the Holy Spirit gives us something to reflect on before we celebrate the end of time next weekend. Next weekend is the Solemnity of Christ the King, which closes out the liturgical year for the church every year. And it's a celebration of Christ coming again in power and majesty. And it's a reminder to us each year that everything will come to an end, one way or the other, either at our particular death or at the coming of Christ. And so we look forward to that day, not in fear, but in joyful expectation. But how do we get there? Well, ask yourself these 3 questions and pray with them as we prepare ourselves for the Solemnity of Christ the King. Where is Christ calling me to silence instead of commentary? Where is Christ calling me to work humbly instead of worrying about things that are outside of my concern? And where am I being called to stand firm in the faith instead of leaning on old excuses and old fears? And do not be afraid to hear the answer of Christ in the stillness, the quiet, and the beauty of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Christ has been answering his church for 2,000 years. All we must do is have the courage to show up and say, Lord, teach me your ways.